Welcome everybody to this afternoon's brown bag lunch from the Gender Equity Initiative from the ABAA. I am thrilled to have Justin Croft here. I happened to come across an essay that he wrote that he published, put on Ex Libris, and it inspired me to reach out and say, can you please tell us about this story? So I will introduce Justin. Justin Croft has over 30 years experience in the rare book trade and holds a Ph.D. in medieval bibliography. In 2005, he established Justin Croft Antiquarian Books that specializes in rare, unique, and exceptional books and manuscripts, and have since worked with private and institutional customers around the world. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lizzie.
Oh, before, I'm just going to make sure everybody knows just to keep you on mute. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we will be happy to take care of it at the end. Thanks.
Yes, thanks very much, Lizzie. Thank you very much for inviting me. It didn't take me long to say yes, actually. You caught me on a particularly good moment, and really delighted to participate in this particular group, which I think is a fantastic initiative. And really honoured to have been invited to come and share your brown bag lunch with you. It's about, well, it's 7:05 here in the evening, so the contents of my brown bag might be slightly different to the contents of yours, but nonetheless, we are all together, and it's great to see lots of familiar faces or familiar names, friends and colleagues around, mostly in the USA, which is great, and at least one from Faversham too. When we'll talk, we'll go into that a little bit later. So now I've not given a Zoom presentation like this before, so you might just have to bear with me. I'm going to share my screen. I've got some slides to show you, and so if I share that now, you can tell me whether you can all see my title slide. How does that look? Can you see? Yes, we're all okay? Excellent. Okay, well, it's a pleasure to welcome you in a way virtually to Faversham, which is my hometown, or my adopted hometown for the last 25 years. It's a little market town in Kent, in the very far southeast of England, midway between London and Dover, and just about 10 miles from the cathedral city of Canterbury. I couldn't resist taking these two photographs earlier this afternoon because Faversham's looking pretty good today. In the sunshine. This picture on the left is this is my street, West Street. My little office is just here next to the lady in orange, drinking outside the Sun Inn. And the image on the right is the Market Square, which is just a few yards further up the road with our Guildhall, which was built partly in the early 1600s and then renewed in the 18th century. So yeah. Really just to show you these pictures. It's not, it looks particularly nice today. It's partly to situate what I'm going to talk about today, which is very much a local find, but it's also, I hope, to entice you to come and visit us. You're always very welcome in Faversham if you're ever over in England. We're just an hour outside of London. So please do come and see me. You'd be extremely welcome. So Faversham, as you can probably see, is quite an ancient town, and my office is just off the Market Square. In a building which actually does date from the 14th century. You see these beams behind me, which are 14th century. And we are, I think, privileged to be surrounded by historic buildings. And the town is very fortunate to possess a range of historical artifacts, which include books and documents. Not least one of the very early versions of the document known as Magna Carta, which is displayed in the town hall, just a few yards up in the Market Square. Now, most of these books and documents and artifacts are very well loved. Many of them are very well known and have long been documented. But I'm pleased to say that there are discoveries still to be made. And I'd like to talk about one of them with you today. And I should emphasize that what I have to say here is entirely non-commercial in its aim. I think most of us here, with a few exceptions, are booksellers, I know. But one of the great pleasures of our profession, from my point of view, is being asked by non-booksellers, either specialists or non-specialists, asked by them about books and their culture in general. And I, for one, very much enjoy the opportunity to put what I've learned in bookselling to work on occasional non-commercial public history context programs in my immediate community. It gives me great pleasure to do that. So this is a side project from my normal day-to-day work, which, as you know, is as a bookseller. I should also say that what I have to say is very provisional. I'm aware that this is going to be recorded and will probably end up on YouTube somewhere. So this is not to apologize for what I'm going to say, but merely just to make it clear that this is very much work in progress. And in some cases, it's work barely begun. And the very point, I think, of coming to talk to you from my point of view is to share it with you and really to hear a little bit about what you might think about it and to hear your thoughts and views perhaps on how we might take what we've found onwards, both in an academic and scholarly context, but also a public history and community context. So the story for me began back in February, a rather darker day than the one you see here on the screen. I was, you know, we all have those days at the beginning of February where we're, I don't know, we're possibly a little jaded, ready for something to happen. And it was one of those days when an email dropped into my inbox from a member of the team at our local museum. Our local museum is called the Fleur-de-Lis Heritage Centre. It's barely 100 yards from where I am. It's based in a very ancient, an ancient inn, which was called the Fleur-de-Lis, hence it being called the Fleur-de-Lis Heritage Centre. Anyway, the email came in from a friend, Paul Morbath, who I'm very pleased to say is joining us today. Hello, Paul. Thank you for joining in. I have to say also that much of what I'm going to say is based on Paul's input and research. Any errors, definitely mine, but a huge amount of this thinking comes from Paul. So Paul was sorting some miscellaneous books in the attics of the Fleur-de-Lis, which is a kind of timber frame building, and the attics are vertiginous, quite hard to get into and even harder to get out of. And Paul was doing great service sorting books. And he emailed to say that he'd found a couple of interesting books, which had been safely stored in those attics for years, but had never really been looked at in detail. I think all museums have these areas which are perhaps less well charted than others, shall we say. And these books were in one of those areas. So these books were not technically hidden, but to all intents and purposes, they were hidden from the sight in the sense that nobody really knew they were there, and certainly they were and remain pretty well unrecorded. So it's another reason for talking about them today. Now, fortunately for us, Paul is a retired librarian, so he has an eye for unusual books. We've had lots of interesting discussions around books over the last couple of years. Anyway, he sent me this picture, which, as you can imagine, as a bookseller, was pretty interesting to me. 2 pages in this opening, and I could read right from the beginning. So my eye was immediately drawn to that lovely woodcut letter M, which drew me on to read the text. Most benign Lord Jesu, grant me thy grace, that it may always work in me, and persevere with me unto the end. Grant me that I may ever desire and will that which is most pleasant and most acceptable to thee. So this is a prayer, isn't it? And this is a prayer in English, and it runs on for many, many verses over several pages, and it's a fervent and direct address to the divine in the English tongue. And over the page, which I don't have a picture of, it continues, put me where thou wilt, and freely do with me in all things after thy will, which is the phrase I have appropriated for my title because it seemed to fit what I was going to talk about best. So when this email first came in, obviously at first glance, this was a 16th century book and definitely worth another look. So it didn't really take me long to get my coat on and head round to the Fleur-de-Lis to go and see Paul and this book. And when I had it in my hands, it turned out to be not just one book, but actually 3 little books, 3 books bound together. And they were bound together in a very plain 19th century binding, which I'll show you a little bit later. And before being bound together, it was clear that all of them had seen a great deal of life. And the first and the last books in the volume were actually heavily defective. They were fragments, really, and they were missing leaves at the beginning and at the end, and some of the surviving leaves were really quite badly wormed or frayed, and that damage had been made good rather crudely, probably at the time that they were put together into the binding. But what also seemed evident to me was that all three of these fragments had actually been together for a long, long time, probably much longer than the present binding. Somehow they seemed to belong together, despite being three distinct fragments. But I have to say, even with a little bit of bookseller knowledge and some conversancy with bibliography, I found it quite hard, and I'm still finding it quite hard to unpack and understand exactly what we've got. And part of why I'm talking to you today is that I hope you might be able to offer me some help with directions in identifying these books. Okay, so immediately, of course, I leafed through this book as we bibliophiles do. I wanted to see as much as I could of it and really understand how it worked. And I found that only one of these fragments retained something that could be called a title page. And this is that opening here. On the right-hand side here is the only title page among the three fragments in this volume. And I have to say, reading it kind of brought me up short. And I'm going to read it to you again here. So it begins, prayers or meditations, wherein the mind is stirred, patiently to suffer all afflictions here, to set at naught the vain prosperity of this world, and always to long for everlasting felicity, collected out of holy works by the most virtuous and gracious Princess Catherine, Queen of England, France and Ireland, Anno Domini 1545. So there it was, and a quick glance at the ESTC database and STC confirmed that the princess referred to was in fact Katherine Parr, then Queen and the sixth wife of Henry VIII, the Queen, as we all know, who survived him after his death in 1547. That's her name on the title page. Having the final leaf of the preceding fragment was also helpful, and I take it that is the final leaf, because it gives the text of a very distinctive prayer. You can see at the top, it says a prayer in the running headline there, but the first line of that final page reads, that no Christian blood be spilt. And that lets us identify quite quickly that this is another book which can largely be attributed to Queen Katherine Parr, namely a book entitled Psalms or Prayers, which was first printed in 1544. And that book consists largely of Catherine's translations or adaptations into English of some Latin psalm paraphrases by Bishop John Fisher. That's Bishop John Fisher, who was Bishop of Rochester, not too far away from here in Kent, but also the Bishop John Fisher, who had been executed by Catherine's husband, Henry VIII, back in 1535. But along with the psalm paraphrases, there are at least two prayers in that volume, which are much more closely associated by Catherine, and perhaps to a large extent her own work. And those include this final prayer, which you can see on the left-hand side of this page, which was a prayer written for soldiers going into battle. And it was written by her in direct response to Henry's ill-advised final military campaign in northern France. Now, the other fragment in the book is rather more problematical and harder to identify, but it's roughly from the same date. And that seems to contain large sections of a book called the Exhortation and Litanies, or the text called Exhortation and Litanies by Archbishop Cranmer, the Tudor Archbishop, which again was first published in 1544. And it's important because it's the earliest officially authorized vernacular service in English. It's a very important book. It's an immensely significant text culturally, and it was an attempt to appropriate the form of the ancient Roman Catholic Litany of the Saints, which is familiar to many of us from medieval books of hours. It's an attempt to appropriate and translate that into a Reformed Protestant religion. And the text of the Exhortation and Litany has had an amazing afterlife in the sense that it still survives in modified form in the Book of Common Prayer to the present day. So, one volume with 3 fragments bound together. And this is my moving attempt to provide an account for each of the 3 parts. You'll see item 1, I say it's an edition of the King's Primer. I'm not sure that's quite right, but it does, as I say further on, contain sections of Cranmer's Exhortation and Liturgy. It's missing its title page and all before leaf G1, and survives in a fragment of only 190 pages. The second part of the volume is the Psalms or Prayers, which are translations by Katherine Parr, as I've said. Again, missing a large chunk, wanting certainly a gathering before B1, but complete at the end with that prayer for soldiers, which I've just shown you. And then the final part of the volume, which is sadly the most fragmentary, I think, it's really only 28 leaves, is perhaps the most interesting text. It's Prayers or Meditations, which contains a considerable body of original prayers by Katherine Parr. Okay, so I keep changing this text every couple of days. I go back and look at it and to try and rough out exactly what we've got in the volume. It's been very interesting going through the bibliography of these books, and in the process of identifying the editions, obviously, I think what I found is that they are not first editions, although these things first came out in 1544 and 1545. I think what we've got are editions of roughly 1547, perhaps 1548. Reason for that is, and it was Paul who very kindly pointed this out to me, at least one of the texts names the king as Edward VI. So they were printed probably in the very first year of the next king after Henry VIII, the young boy king, Edward VI. It's been very interesting to see that there were so many early editions of these tiny little books. It seems they were often reprinted in the course of just a few years. And while there are no shortages of early editions, I think surviving copies of them are actually pretty rare. If I look in ESTC and STC together, you see a range of editions, but you see that actually surviving copies are very small in number. Often you just get 1 or 2 copies, perhaps surviving in British Library or one of the Oxford or Cambridge colleges. Sometimes you get 2, but you very rarely get more than a handful of copies. So these are very rare books indeed. And I think that's striking. I'm always interested in print runs, and I think people will know more about this than I do in this period. I'm interested to know how many copies of a little book would have been printed. I think we normally think of small books as being printed in rather larger quantities than larger books. That's my assumption. But I've seen it asserted that early editions of these books were printed in small numbers, perhaps just for circulation at court by Katherine Parr. I'm not sure that's quite correct, but it's very striking that so few of them survive today. I think others know this, I'm sure, that small books have a much higher rate of attrition than larger books. That may be one explanation. They're simply more vulnerable, and they are generally more intended for practice, for use in the hands, whereas folio books tend to stick around for longer. Okay, let's just go back to the Prayers or Meditations title page. As I've said, our Faversham examples are, in a way, humble survivals. They are just fragments. They are not first editions. They are slightly later editions. But somehow they seem to me to have a kind of quiet charisma, which is one of my favorite attributes in a rare and antiquarian book. And I think what's so important, and it took me quite a while to realize this, is that Prayers and Meditations is actually the first book published in England by a woman under her own name and in the English language. I find that really quite remarkable. These three books are also books which demonstrate the swift progress of the English Reformation in the 1540s. It's interesting to look at them in the context of these other happy recent discoveries, which we've all been looking at on social media and in the news in the last couple of weeks. Do you know what I'm talking about? These amazing royal prayer books, which have long been known, but never really been thought about. These are the books of hours, French books of hours printed in 1527, one which was owned by Thomas Cromwell, and the other which was owned by Anne Boleyn. It turns out that Thomas Cromwell's book is the very one which is pictured with him in his portrait by Holbein in the Frick. And after all these years, no one has actually realized that until a couple of relatively young new scholars simply took the trouble to look a bit harder than everyone else and identify that Thomas Cromwell's book was actually the one in his portrait. Anne Boleyn's book, which is of exactly the same edition, I think, of 1527, is now at Hever Castle, which is her family home, which is also down here in Kent. So it's been really interesting looking at our rather humbler fragments in the context of those rather earlier royal prayer books. What's interesting is that, to me, is that in 1527, someone like Anne Boleyn was using as a book of personal devotion, obviously a book in Latin, a book which was printed on the continent, albeit for English usage, but one which was really a very traditional medieval era book of hours. So that's Anne Boleyn. And just 20 years later, we get Henry VIII's last queen. Now, she's not just using and reading prayer books, she's composing her own in English, and she's having them printed in London, even to the point of putting her own name on the title page. And that's been really interesting for me. I have been a historian, I suppose, but I'm not a royal historian. I don't know much about royal history, and I've had to kind of catch up on this. And what's been so exciting to me is to really realize how much this literate production of Katherine Parr's was part of a joint enterprise at court, at Henry VIII's court, or more properly, Katherine Parr's court. This is the famous portrait done, I think it's the very end of Henry's reign, just the period we're talking about, which shows him, the beast himself, sitting on his throne, surrounded by his court. On his left is his son, young Prince Edward VI. On this side, this is Katherine Parr. On this side, this is Mary, later to be queen. And on the right-hand side is Princess Elizabeth, also later to be queen. And what I've realized in reading around this subject is the extent to which these three women were interlocked in their researches and their literate engagement, reading liturgy and scripture, in some cases discussing it, and in other cases translating it, and in Katherine Parr's case, actually publishing it under her own name. And also what's striking is really realizing how, I'm not going to say necessarily how brave that was. Obviously this is in the court of Henry VIII. Actually, maybe it's incredibly brave to be doing anything at the court of Henry VIII, given his capricious nature and the way in which his previous wives were dealt with. But it's astonishing to the extent to which they were, if you like, at the forefront of a particular kind of literary culture in these few years in the 1540s. It's actually a really interesting time just now to be looking at these little prayer books, not least because, has anyone seen this? This is a new film that's just come out, all about Katherine Parr. It's called Firebrand, and it's based on a novel by Elizabeth Fremantle, which was called The Queen's Gambit. I didn't know anything about it until I was Googling around Katherine Parr, and then I saw that somehow she was appearing at the Cannes Film Festival just a couple of weeks ago. And there is this amazing new movie focusing on the life and the personal and public life of Katherine Parr. So it's rather exciting that we found these books at just this moment. And if that kind of synchronicity isn't enough, I was also excited to find via Google that our friends at Sotheby's have, or are going to be offering this incredible contemporary portrait of Katherine Parr on July the 5th, 2023, in a couple of weeks' time. This is a portrait, it's really a portrait to conjure with, isn't it? Probably painted around 1548, they think. Again, exactly the period we're talking about, not being seen, certainly not seen on the market for several generations, and probably not being seen at all for several generations. I'm probably not even meant to be showing it to you, but since it's on Sotheby's website, I think we're fine. We're fine. But it's wonderful to be looking at our Katherine Parr fragments against this background of new discoveries. Okay, so that's a little bit about the books themselves. So Katherine Parr, her court, and the production of Prayerbooks. But I'd like to look now at a feature of our particular Faversham book, which is beyond the printed text, namely the later inscriptions, which appear on one of the flyleaves. I'm sorry, this slide is a little bit blurred. This is one of mine. Sorry. I want to look at the middle line. Really, you can just see. Can you see my cursor going across there, which says "Found hidden away in an old chimney, 1881, George Johnson." And this is the thing that I think originally piqued Lizzie's curiosity when I posted it on Ex Libris. So there's this inscription on one of the flyleaves by this chap, George Johnson. And what you can't see is that there's also a letter tipped in just before that from a local vicar, a Faversham vicar, writing to Mr. Johnson, thanking him very much for showing him the prayer book that he'd found and attempting to identify exactly what it was he had. And I think it was probably at this time when the vicar and George Johnson of Faversham were discussing the book that it was decided that it was going to be rebound and put in a late 19th century binding. So George Johnson writes on his book, "Found hidden away in an old chimney, 1881. I particularly like, by the way, the fact that he's written on it in purple indelible pencil. It speaks of that kind of anxiety about writing on old books, the idea that perhaps you only write on old books in pencil. And yet the idea that actually he wanted to write on it permanently. So a halfway house was the purple indelible pencil. So this is George Johnson. Now he's quite a well-known figure in 19th century Faversham. He was a local builder. This is a wonderful advert found by Paul Morbath and the volunteers at the Fleur-de-Lis Heritage Centre from a Faversham Institute journal from the 1880s. So this is George Johnson, builder and house decorator of St Mary's Road, Faversham, again, very much in the middle of Faversham. And he's advertising his services among the wedding, luncheon and school cake makers, agents to the Tower Tea Company. And certainly he would have worked pretty well exclusively around Faversham in the 19th century, particularly the years of 1880 to about 1900. Paul has done some excellent work trawling through reams of local journals and local papers, both in microfilm and in physical form. Thank you for doing this, Paul. Sadly, we haven't actually turned anything up. We thought perhaps George might have announced his discovery somewhere else, perhaps in the local press, but so far nothing has appeared. Anyway, what's interesting is that George Johnson claims to have found this book in an old chimney. And I think the assumption is that old chimney was going to be in Faversham or in the immediate area, given the scope of his work at that time. Now, I've always been really curious about objects hidden away in the fabric of buildings. I originally studied archaeology, and this was something that used to fascinate me. I also worked for a time at the what was then called the Cambridge Folk Museum, and they had a fantastic little collection of things that have been found in houses, including something called a witch bottle, which is just the kind of thing people used to hide in houses as some kind of talisman or charm against evil. And so, yeah, I've got a curiosity for concealed items. I also had half an idea that I'd come across some scholarship on concealed books. I thought perhaps someone might have surveyed examples of books found in the fabric of buildings. I mean, it seems to me a great topic, and I thought someone must have done it. I'd certainly had memories of lots of reports of things found in chimneys, And when we talk about things found in chimneys, what we're really talking about is not necessarily stuff right up the chimney, but actually in the vicinity of the ingle nook, which is the big area around the chimney, which would have lots of small compartments for keeping foodstuffs, keeping things warm, keeping salt dry, and this kind of thing. And it must have been very tempting to tuck away valuable items in an ingle nook fireplace. And I suspect that's where our book was found. So anyway, this is why I posted my query about hidden books on Ex Libris. I can't remember if it was in February and March. I think us booksellers all know about Ex Libris. It's a tremendously useful message group, listserv. We all use it. We often take a deep breath before posting on it because it can elicit a range of responses and one never quite knows where the conversation is going to go. But in this case, having posted a request as to whether anyone knew about information on hidden books, I did get some really interesting responses. No one came up with references to the sort of survey or scholarly work which I had half remembered or thought might exist, but there was no shortage of examples of other things hidden in walls, roofs, and hidden chambers, and they ranged from dead desiccated cats to live Catholic priests. There were some people who expressed reservation about reading too much into my evidence, or reading anything at all into this kind of record. There really isn't, if we're honest, enough to go on, except for my instinct is to take at face value the written evidence within the book. But I do accept that one must be cautious and not read too much into it. There were other people who very perceptively pointed out a curious need, I suppose particularly among antiquarians, but I think more widely, a sort of need to interpret finds as having been lost or deliberately hidden to be found at some point in the future. And I think that's very interesting. We often find what we are looking for, don't we? But anyway, most tantalizing of all was some information submitted by more than one person about a recent find of books, I think a couple of years ago, a find of books and papers hidden away in the roof of a country house here in England, namely Oxburgh Hall in Suffolk, which isn't 1,000 miles away from here. And among those books and papers, rather extraordinarily, was another copy of Katherine Parr's Psalms or Prayers. Now, two examples of a book found hidden away in these circumstances, again, is not really a big enough sample to suggest that Catherine's book was just the kind of book that you should hide away. And of course, we may not be comparing like with like when we talk about the two situations. Oxburgh Hall was home of a recusant Catholic family who may have had good reason to hide texts away in their attic. Kent is a rather different, certainly Faversham is a rather different cultural landscape at this point. Anyway, one of the happiest outcomes of my Ex Libris posting was being contacted by the leading scholar currently on the works of Katherine Parr, namely Micheline White, Associate Professor of English Literature at Carleton University, Canada. And thrilled to see that you're with us here today, Micheline. Thank you very much for joining us. Of course, I'd be interested to hear about things you might have to say afterwards, but I'm honoured and thrilled that you were able to join us. Thank you again. Now, even in our fleeting email correspondence, Micheline has kindly sent me a couple of very useful pieces of information in the last couple of months. I think we've both been doing other things, preoccupied with daily life. We've shared a couple of emails, but I feel I've learned already a huge amount about Katherine Parr's writings and their astonishing afterlife in English literature and English culture to the present day. One of the things Micheline pointed out to me early on was Katherine Parr's collaboration with the composer Thomas Tallis, and the way in which some of her texts ended up set to music by Thomas Tallis. So you can actually you can go onto Spotify and you can listen to this music being performed to the original settings by Thomas Tallis. There's one particular disc by, I forget the name of the group, I think it's David Skinner, who's the director, which is a really very moving account of the way in which Katherine Parr has entered into our culture. So anyway, I am cautious of reading too much into the very sparse evidence we have for the location of George Johnson the Builder's find. But I have to say, in Faversham, we have nonetheless speculated on the reason for concealing a book like this. Because they were probably, I think, looking at them very closely, these were probably defective books, even when they were first hidden away, assuming they were. I think they were bound together from a very early date. The way in which they're worn and wormed suggests that the outer leaves of the first and the last text were certainly just that, on the outside of a volume, whereas the joins between the texts in the middle are not at all worn or wormed, and I suspect that they were together, perhaps even from the very first. And it has occurred to me that I need to be careful with my bibliography in case these are in fact three works which were at some point issued together under another title, which I have not yet understood. But I am pretty certain that they were published around the year 1547, 1548. So anyway, yes, Paul Morbarth and I have been reading these texts for their own sake, really. Paul much more than I, and he's occasionally sent me images of some particularly striking passages in these texts, and we've been thinking about their religious and political sensitivity in the 16th century. And in our minds is very much the suspicion cast on prayer books in English, which came about during the later Catholic revival in the reign of Queen Mary. Now, some Protestant books do seem to have remained acceptable in Mary's reign, notably and interestingly, Katherine Parr's Prayers and Meditations. Micheline has pointed out to me the fascinating fact that there was actually a reprint of Prayers and Meditations during Queen Mary's reign. And that's really a fact to conjure with, I think, since Mary was kind of there at the start and yet at a polar opposite in terms of religious persuasion. There are other books which would very definitely have been suspect and indeed, I think, considered heretical during Mary's reign. And one of them, I think, is Cranmer's Litany, which forms part of our first text in this volume. Let's just turn to, oh yes, this is the binding. I should have shown you before. This is how we found it in the attic. Let's just turn to one page of Cranmer's Litany, which comes quite early in our volume. And again, if we're looking at striking text, this really is one. 2 lines from the top below the litany, in the small text begins, "Good Lord, deliver us." And that's an exhortation from a priest. And the answer is, from the congregation, "From all sedition and privy conspiracy, from the tyranny of the Bishop of Rome and all his detestable enormities, from all false doctrine and heresy, from all hardness of heart and contempt of thy word and commandment." So assuming our book had been in Faversham or its area in the 1550s, which I think it almost certainly was, we think there would have been every reason to hide it up a chimney. We have to remember how close we are to the city of Canterbury here, that great religious centre where in the 1550s a group of Protestant martyrs were indeed burnt at the stake for participating in just this kind of Protestant liturgy. And it's hard to see how owning a book containing the statement that I've just read could be seen as anything other than inflammatory to Marian Catholic orthodoxy. But I don't want to go too far before I've really understood what this book is. I think we've got a lot to learn about how book ownership was viewed in this period and the way in which heresy was examined and prosecuted before drawing too many conclusions. And I think if I've learned anything in studying Kent in particular over the years, is that it's very hard to make any generalizations about the way in which anything was seen in one community or another. There's a huge variation of religious sentiment in Canterbury, in Kent, from the very orthodox to the very unorthodox. We get some exciting and interesting extremes of opinion in this very crowded corner of England. So anyway, I've almost said enough. I think really what I want to do next is just to ask a little bit about what we're going to do with this little book. I mean, it's a lovely thing. It's a fragment. We've had a little bit of repair done to the binding just so that it can be displayed. It's hard to say how much more can be drawn from these fragments in scholarly terms. There are no annotations to decipher and interpret, for example. But given the rarity of surviving copies, even pinning down the precise editions of each of these fragments, I think will be valuable, and that's certainly my next project. As I've said, I'm fairly sure I've identified 2 of the editions, the Psalms and the Prayers, and the Prayers and Meditations, but I haven't identified the edition of the English Litany. Paul and I have spent a good deal of time poring over the bibliographies and the online texts on Evo so far without producing any exact match. And it does occur to me that there's every chance that our edition may turn out to be unrecorded in that case. But I hope what I've shown here is that what we've got is worthy not just of preservation, which of course it will be preserved, but of sharing more widely and encouraging others to think a little more about a book like this, origins and meaning. We'll be putting the book on display here in Faversham this summer as part of a local initiative to share our rich material culture. We have an event called Open Faversham, which is very much a kind of evangelical project in the historical sense, not the religious sense, I hasten to add. It's very much an opportunity to show off what we have and bring in a new audience and new enthusiasm into our local history, which is so rich. It's a challenging book to display, being a tiny book, but in my experience, showing such artifacts attracts incredible interest among the general public. I think all of you who are antiquarian booksellers just know what a kind of tangible response you get from most lay people, if you like. I don't like to call them that, but yeah, the general public, when they see some of the things that we deal with, you get a tangible sense of, you get a wow factor, a tangible sense of appreciating the age, but also really appreciating what they mean in cultural terms. This book is going to take a little bit of explaining, but I'm confident and excited to be bringing it to a wider audience. So let me leave it there. I've said enough. I'd love to perhaps hear a little bit from anyone who's interested in the audience. I'm not sure how we're going to do this, Lizzie. I think I might leave it to you to explain how anyone might like to.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody has any questions, please offer them up in the chat. If that's at the bottom, you just press on that.
Let me
type
make sure I can see that.
Your question.
I'll stop sharing my screen for now.
While we're waiting for that, I have a question of what was your physical experience when you opened that book? I just feel like when you saw that, and this is not something that I deal with very often. I'm more in the contemporary world of books, but just seeing that name and seeing that date, did you have any kind of physical?
Yeah, no, I really did. And I'm sort of, in a way, that's what I'm trying to carry forward now, that initial, and we all know about this as antiquarians, that amazing tangible sensation of excitement when we first see something which we haven't thought about before, which may be very old, which is going to take some interpretation. But yeah, no, I wasn't quite trembling, but it was quite hard to hold the book. Well, what was great about it is that it doesn't give away its secrets quickly. So actually, the pleasure was expanded or extended as we started to look into it. But yeah, of course, it's tremendously exciting.
Right. Yeah, and we got what is the format of the book and size from
Sure.
Ben?
So yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, so it's technically duodecimo, I guess. I say that, and I actually need to check that. Someone's going to help. I hope perhaps Micheline might be able to help me with this, whether it's octavo or duodecimo. But it's a tiny book. It's a tiny book that fits in the palm of the hand and smaller, really. I suspect our copy has been cut down slightly at the time of binding, but these are definitely handbooks. Mm-hmm.
Another question I actually had was the missing pages, and this is literally actually kind of a lay question. Would if somebody wanted would they have pulled pages out? I mean,
this is what I'm wondering, because there's the kind of natural attrition at the front and the back, which is worms, and if it were stuffed up a chimney, it's soot, smoke, or whatever. But yes, what's strange is that there aren't sort of stray pages here and there missing, but there are chunks missing. This is really what I'm trying to do, is to give accurate bibliographical account of them. So it's quite possible that somebody decided to take a large chunk out of the beginning of the text with the litany, for example. They left the bit about the enormity of the Bishop of Rome in there. It's very, very hard, isn't it, to say how much credence or how much valency you could give to this kind of speculation, or is it accident or is it deliberate? I just don't know at this point, but that's certainly the way I want to go.
Right, because somebody would have been in danger of having this, or
yeah, I think so. I mean, to have a book with that statement in it, and I might be entirely wrong about this, but if in the light of what was going on in Mary's reign, with large numbers of burnings, people for heretical views, if you had this book in your possession and you still felt strongly attached to it, probably because you still adhered to the faith which was expressed within it, sure, you would hide it. You would either get rid of it or you would hide it, I think.
Right, which is really interesting considering what's going on in the book world these days, the book bannings and all that. Micheline notes that
yeah,
it's I think these ones are octavos.
Okay, thank you very much. That's brilliant. Brilliant.
But yeah, similar. I mean, obviously, hopefully nobody's being burnt at the stake at this point, but
not at this point, no. But we are, we're at a point of polarization, aren't we? And I think there are, without drawing kind of bland comparisons between the mid-16th century and our own century, yes, there are, intense polarizations. And what I find so interesting when I read the scholarship on these books is, or on this religious situation, is really the extent to which this kind of sectarianism and partisanship carries over. I mean, there are Catholic historians and there are Protestant historians writing today on these subjects in a very moderate way, I have to say. They're not zealots, but there's a very strong Catholic historiographical movement. People might have heard of the scholar Eamon Duffy, who's a Catholic scholar of great distinction, but writes from a strongly Catholic point of view. And there have always been people writing from a strongly evangelical Protestant point of view. And it's amazing how much that carries on into their objective scholarship. And I'm not criticizing, I'm merely observing at that point.
Right. I also wanted you maybe, Justin, to maybe type in your information so that if somebody has further questions, they'll know how to get in touch with you. I know how to get in touch with you, but Heather O'Donnell asked, can you say anything about the marketing distribution of Parr's prayer books? How would a family in Kent have purchased one?
Yeah, that's a great question, Heather, and really that's sort of the next. that's another small project. I mean, there's a great kind of thesis in all of this stuff. What's interesting about Parr's prayer books is that they also circulated, Micheline knows more about this than I do, they circulated in manuscript. She had manuscript copies made of these to give to the immediate court. And I think only then, or perhaps in parallel, they were printed. These are definitely commercially published. I've read this idea that they must have been printed in small numbers, and I don't really understand how a commercial publisher could publish in small numbers and still remain solvent. So I think you would have to make it to release into the general book market. And Kent is very, very tied into the London market. I mean, daily boats going in and out of Faversham Creek up into London. We're kind of rural now, but we have in the past been even more closely linked to London than we are today. So yeah, we're very much part of the London commercial market, and it would be very easy for a Kent person to have that book probably bought in a bookshop in London. I'm not sure about local booksellers at this point. There probably were booksellers in Faversham, but I don't have evidence of them.
I think we have Micheline here. Welcome.
I wasn't expecting to appear on camera, but that's fine. My hair isn't too bad.
You look fabulous. You had something of a
well,
an answer here.
say, yeah, I mean, these are books are being sold by Bertlet, right? The King's printer. So yes, you're absolutely right. They're part of the commercial, world. Parr does appear, as you mentioned, to have had special editions printed on vellum, which were given out as gifts. But the ones that you've identified, these are on regular paper. So yeah, they were, Parr would be thrilled that they were being purchased, if they were being purchased by someone in Kent. They were intended to be distributed nationally, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Right.
Ben asks, actually, is there any research on the readership of early women authors in England?
I'm pretty sure there is. Micheline, you might have to help me here, but certainly in terms of readership in general, and this is in sort of manuscript culture as well, the crossover with manuscript culture. I mean, it's kind of everywhere, and stretches quite far down the social scale. And they're whether or not women were reading to each other, certainly women did own books, and I would be pretty sure that women owned books like this. There's something about the physical format of a book like this, which even in manuscript culture presupposes a partly private and feminine ownership. That's something which I think runs very deep in book culture, from 100 years before this and beyond. But yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about readership in Kent, but I do know that it has been quite heavily studied.
It would be actually interesting to talk to a textile historian to figure out, the pockets of women's garments and the size of this book, and if that kind of correlates.
Yeah.
There were even smaller versions of all of these same books printed. So the Psalms or Prayers was also printed in a sexodecimo, which is like the 16mo, the really tiny one. So this is I think of it as sort of the bigger one. I guess
okay,
it's small.
right, yeah.
It's not
okay.
a quarto, but these octavos are bigger than some of the other editions, which really are like tiny to really put in your pocket. But I guess you can put an octavo in your pocket too. I did have one comment that I wanted to make. If you're thinking about directions to take this, so first of all, I just love this presentation, and thanks so much for sharing this find with us. I do think this is just sort of information, is that there are many examples of the Psalms and Prayers bound with the prayers or meditation, and sometimes a primer. So, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon. Kimberly Coles talks a little bit about this in a book she published in 2008, and she points out that the Psalms and Prayers are often found today bound with the prayers and meditations, which you don't know if you're using EBO, right? Because you can't tell what's being bound with what. Right. But there are many examples. Like there's one at Oxford where it's bound with something. There's another one in Lincoln Cathedral, and those two books are bound together. And what she says is it suggests that Bertlet is sort of promoting. So even though the Psalms or Prayers is anonymous and the Prayers or Meditations has Parr's name on it, that he's selling them at the same time. And so people who are buying one are also buying the other, right? I mean, that maybe explain why there are so many instances of them being bound together. But what I think you might want to pursue is, like, as you point out, these are probably published under Edward. And so it means that this idea that Parr is an important author and that her books should be bought together, and that she has, like, it's like Amazon. If you bought this, you probably should buy this, right? And that she's still, that buyers are still thinking of these books as belonging as part of a package, right? And especially with the King's Primer too, I think that's totally fascinating. So Henry's dead. There's a new order. But Parr is very much part of that. Her books are still being reprinted as sort of, and the thing about the Psalms or Prayers is that it's issued by the king sort of anonymously. It's like a crown publication that she happens to be the vehicle for. And, I think you could really press on that argument that your book shows that people are still interested in thinking of Parr as an important author who produced multiple works, and you want to get them all and bind them together.
That's really interesting, because it does chime very much with what I suspected at just looking at these copies, that somehow these three were actually issued together somehow.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean they all came off the press at the same time. You imagine someone like Bertlet had stocks of these books, and I think he or a bookseller close to him was quite likely issuing them in exactly the way, you know, as a 3-pack all together, in a different kind of binding. The kind of mirror image of the title page of the prayers or meditation with the tailpiece of that soldier's prayer. I don't know if I can quickly share my screen again.
Oh yeah, so there's no
very
colophon
pleasing
between them, right?
kind of symmetry between those two. You know, I don't think that's by accident. I think those two have been put together and possibly printed with the, you know, with the idea that they would be issued together.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you should pursue that. That's great.
Wow, this is great. Wow, this has been a really like super fun hour. Thank you, Justin. And thank you everybody for coming.